The sound came before the light. A heavy fist slammed against the cabin door, while the valley still slept beneath a pale gray sky. The old pine walls trembled with every strike. Outside, boots scraped across frozen ground, and horses snorted clouds into the bitter morning air. Ren Calloway set down the kettle without rushing. She looked once at the small fire glowing inside the stone hearth. Then she pulled on her coat, opened the door, and stepped into the cold that bit through wool like tiny knives. 3 men waited in the yard. One held folded papers. Another rested a hand near the pistol at his hip. The third never looked directly at her. None of them had come to help. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people who survive impossible winters with quiet strength, stay with this one. The hardest battle had not even begun. The oldest man unfolded the paper with careful hands. Harlan Briggs now owns this land. His words drifted into the freezing wind. You have until sunset tomorrow to leave. Ren did not answer. Instead, she looked beyond them toward the cottonwood trees lining the creek. Their bare branches barely moved, yet tiny crystals floated through the air. That was wrong. Snow should not travel before the wind. Her father had taught her that many years ago. When snow wandered alone, a dangerous storm usually followed. She looked back at the strangers. You picked a poor week. The man frowned. I'm not here to discuss the weather. No, she nodded quietly. I suppose you aren't. The sheriff shifted his weight. His eyes never met hers. Everyone in Crook County knew Elias Calloway had built this ranch with his own hands. Everyone also knew he had died the previous spring. Now a stranger claimed the land belonged to him. Something about it did not fit. Ren could feel it the same way she could feel weak ice beneath fresh snow. The papers might have carried a county seal, but paper could lie. The land rarely did. She stepped back inside. The men watched as she gathered only what mattered: a sharpened axe, a heavy wool blanket, a sack of dried beans, coffee wrapped in cloth, her father's old compass. Nothing more. One of the men glanced around the cabin. You're leaving everything else? Ren lifted the sack onto her shoulder. Wood tables can be built again. She rested one hand on the worn doorway. This cannot. Her fingers touched the rough pine frame for only a heartbeat. Then she walked away without looking back. The men expected shouting. They expected tears. Instead, they watched a lone woman disappear across frozen grass while the first snowflakes began falling around her. By afternoon, she had crossed the western pasture where rocky hills rose above the valley. Most ranchers hated that ground. Nothing grew there. The soil was thin. The slopes were steep. Even cattle avoided it. Years earlier, neighbors laughed when Elias spent weeks hauling stone toward those hills. They called him stubborn. Some called him foolish. He never answered. He simply kept building. At 14 years old, Ren had carried flat rocks beside him until her shoulders burned. She remembered asking why. Her father had wiped dirt from his hands before pointing toward the mountain sky. Winter never announces itself twice. She had not understood. Now those words returned with every step. The wind grew sharper. Snow thickened. The world slowly faded into white. She searched for the old pine tree standing near the highest ridge. Most people never noticed it. To Ren, it had always been a marker. She finally reached it just before sunset. The snow already covered her boot tracks. Her gloves had frozen stiff. She knelt beside the roots. Nothing. Only rocks buried beneath fresh snow. She brushed harder. More stones appeared. Not natural. Too flat. Too carefully placed. Her heartbeat slowed. This was it. She wedged the axe handle into a narrow crack between two stones and leaned with all her weight. Nothing moved. Again. Still nothing. The wind howled louder. Snow collected across her shoulders. Again. A dull grinding sound answered from below. The stone shifted only an inch. That single inch released a breath of cool air, carrying the smell of dry earth and old pine. Not freezing air. Steady air. Living air. Ren closed her eyes. Her father had not forgotten. She worked for another hour until the stone doorway opened wide enough to reveal narrow steps, disappearing beneath the hill. Darkness waited below. She struck a match. Soft yellow light reached rough stone walls, fitted together with remarkable care. Everything looked exactly as her father had left it. Shelves, tools, water barrels, bundles of firewood stacked above the ground, iron pipes disappearing through the ceiling. Every piece placed where someone had expected another pair of hands to find it years later. Ren stepped inside. The silence wrapped around her. Outside, the storm screamed across the ridge. Inside, the air barely changed. She placed one hand against the stone wall. It felt cool. Not cold, just as her father once promised. Then she noticed something resting on a wooden crate beneath a folded piece of canvas, an oilskin pouch. She picked it up carefully. Inside rested a folded paper covered in her father's handwriting. Only one sentence. When the storm comes, survive first. The truth can wait until spring. Ren folded the note and slipped it inside her coat. Above her, the wind struck the hillside with enough force to shake loose snow from the entrance. The blizzard had arrived, and somewhere back in the valley, the men who had stolen her home believed she had nowhere left to go. The first night beneath the hill felt longer than any night Ren could remember. She did not light a large fire. Instead, she gathered a few dry sticks from the stack her father had left behind and built a flame no bigger than both hands together. The small fire caught slowly. Warm air drifted upward through the stone chamber. The iron vent gave a quiet pull as fresh air slipped inside from outside. Everything worked exactly as Elias had planned years before. Ren watched the flame for a long moment. Her father had built this place as though he had already seen this winter. She spread one wool blanket across the packed earth and another over her shoulders. Outside, the storm struck the hillside again. Snow pounded the hidden doorway. The sound rolled through the stone like distant thunder. Yet inside, the fire barely flickered. The hill itself carried the weight of the blizzard. Morning arrived without sunlight. Ren pushed against the heavy stone entrance. It refused to move. Snow had buried the shelter completely. She smiled to herself. The shelter had disappeared, exactly as her father intended. She returned inside and began studying every corner. Nothing had been placed without reason. Clay jars filled one shelf. Another held dried beans, flour, salt, coffee, and smoked meat sealed inside waxed cloth. Tools hung neatly on wooden pegs. Each carried signs of careful hands. Near the back wall rested several flat stones, stacked beside a small pile of river rock. She remembered helping gather those rocks as a young girl. Back then, they had seemed useless. Now, every piece had a purpose. She cleaned the firebox before adding fresh wood. Then she filled a kettle with melted snow and waited for it to boil. Steam slowly filled the room. For the first time since leaving her cabin, her fingers stopped shaking. As she drank the hot water, her eyes wandered toward the wooden crate again. Inside rested more than food. There were folded maps, lengths of rope, extra blankets, a small leather notebook. She opened it carefully. Every page carried neat writing, measurements, weather notes, simple drawings, instructions for keeping heat inside stone walls, ways to store water without freezing, methods for drying boots beside a fire without ruining the leather. Her father had written everything, not as stories, as lessons. He knew someone would need them. Halfway through the notebook, she stopped reading. One page had only a single sentence. Stone remembers summer long after people forget it. She ran her fingers across the faded words. Then, she quietly closed the book. Hours passed as the storm continued. The wind never rested. Sometimes it roared. Sometimes it whistled through the vent pipes. Sometimes the hill became so still that the silence itself sounded strange. Late that afternoon, a dull noise reached her ears. Not wind, not falling snow. 3 slow knocks. Ren stood immediately, her hand wrapped around the axe. Again. 3 knocks. Someone was outside. She climbed the steps carefully. The stone entrance barely moved after all the snow pressing against it. Cold air rushed inside the moment a narrow opening appeared. A weak voice drifted through the gap. "Miss Calloway." She knew that voice. Walter Briggs, one of the smaller ranchers from the valley. Ren shoved harder until the opening widened enough to see him. Walter collapsed forward. Behind him stood 2 children wrapped beneath one thin blanket. The little girl's lips had turned pale. The boy could barely stand. Ren wasted no words. She carried the girl inside first, then the boy. Walter stumbled down the stone steps on his own before dropping onto the floor beside the fire. None of them spoke. The children stared silently at the warm room. Their eyes moved from the glowing fire to the shelves of food, to the stone walls. The little girl whispered only one thing. "I thought everyone up here was gone." Ren poured hot broth into 3 cups. "Drink slowly." Tiny hands wrapped around warm tin cups. Color slowly returned to their faces. Walter finally looked toward her. "Our roof fell in." He swallowed hard. "I burned every chair, every table, even the bed." His eyes drifted toward the steady fire. "I saw smoke coming from this hill yesterday." Ren listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached for a piece of charcoal. She knelt beside the floor. Instead of giving him food alone, she began drawing. A simple shelter, stone walls, vent pipes, firebox, air moving through the room. Walter watched every line. She explained each step using simple words. Where cold air should enter, where smoke must leave. Why stone held warmth after the fire became smaller. Why digging into a hillside protected people better than fighting the wind above it. When she finished, she handed him the charcoal. "Now you draw it." Walter hesitated. Then he copied every line. The first drawing was uneven. The second looked better. The third was almost perfect. Ren nodded once. "Good." Walter looked confused. "You trust me with this?" She added another piece of wood to the fire. "My father trusted me." The room became quiet again. Hours later, after the children had fallen asleep beside the fire, Walter stared into the flames. "There are others." Ren looked toward him. "The Henderson family." He paused. "The preacher." Another pause. "Old Martha." He rubbed both hands together. "They won't last another storm." Ren looked at the shelves filled with supplies, then toward the notebook her father had left. He had never built this place for one person. He had built it for a future he knew would arrive someday. She stood and gathered extra beans, salt, rope, and 2 blankets. Walter immediately shook his head. "You'll need these." Ren handed him the bundle anyway. "If knowledge stays hidden." She looked toward the stone walls around them. then it becomes as useless as buried firewood. Walter lowered his eyes. Before sunrise, he and the children prepared to leave. The storm had weakened. The sky remained gray, but the wind had finally eased. Ren walked with them to the hidden entrance. Walter stopped before climbing out. "I don't know how I'll repay this." Ren looked across the white valley below. Small rooftops barely showed above deep snow. "You won't." She adjusted the rope across his shoulder. "You'll build." Walter nodded slowly. Then he disappeared into the snow with his children. Ren watched until the blowing snow swallowed their tracks. She closed the stone entrance once more. Then she returned to the fire. She had no way of knowing that before another week passed, someone far more dangerous than the blizzard would begin searching the rocky hill. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. 3 mornings later, the valley looked different. The snow still covered every fence and rooftop, but thin lines of smoke had begun rising from places that had gone cold after the storm. Ren stood outside the hidden shelter, breathing the sharp winter air. She counted them. 1, 3, 5. More than before. Walter had kept his promise. People were building. She turned back toward the shelter, carrying another bundle of firewood beneath one arm. Then she stopped. Fresh boot prints crossed the ridge. Not one person. 3. The tracks were deep, heavy, men carrying weight. Ren crouched beside the nearest print. The heel carried a small crack across the leather. She remembered seeing that same boot outside her cabin the morning she was forced to leave. Harlan Briggs had sent men. She erased her own tracks with a pine branch before slipping back inside the shelter. The stone door settled quietly into place. She lowered the fire until only glowing coals remained. Smoke from the vent became thinner, almost invisible. She waited. Hours passed. Nothing. Then footsteps scraped across the snow above. Voices followed. "They said she came this way," another answered. "Nobody could live up here." A shovel struck frozen ground. Metal scraped against stone. Ren remained perfectly still. Even her breathing slowed. Loose dirt trickled from the ceiling as another blow landed outside. One man laughed. "If she's hiding, this weather will finish the job." Another voice sounded uncertain. "What if she's already dead?" Their footsteps moved farther uphill, then returned again. They searched until late afternoon before finally leaving. Only after darkness covered the valley did Ren lift the stone door enough to look outside. The wind had erased most of their tracks, but one thing remained. They had searched everywhere except beneath the old pine tree. Her father had hidden the entrance where nobody expected it. Even now, the hill protected his secret. The next week brought another visitor. Sheriff Miles Carter climbed the slope alone. His horse waited below. The sheriff removed his hat before speaking. "I know you're here." Ren stayed hidden. "I didn't come with Briggs." Silence answered him. The sheriff reached into his coat and placed something on the snow. A folded envelope. "I should have looked closer at those papers." His voice sounded tired. "I didn't." He stepped backward. "I can't change that." After a long pause, he continued, "But there may still be time." He walked away without waiting for a reply. Ren watched from a narrow opening after he disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did she climb outside. Inside the envelope rested a single note. August Fenwick. Below the name was a small map leading toward an abandoned grain store outside Anvil Creek. Her father's note returned to her mind. Find August. The same name. The sheriff knew. Someone had protected the witness all this time. The next morning before sunrise, Ren left the shelter. She wrapped the papers beneath her coat. The snow reached nearly to Cinder's knees as the old mare carried her carefully through the valley. Every mile demanded patience. By noon, she reached the abandoned store. The front windows were covered with rough boards. Nothing moved. She knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again. A quiet voice drifted from inside. "Who's there?" "Ren Calloway." Several long seconds passed. A heavy bar lifted. The door opened only enough for one eye to appear. Then the old man standing inside slowly opened it wider. His shoulders had bent with age. His white beard rested against his coat, but his eyes remained clear. "You've got your father's face," he said quietly. Ren stepped inside. The room smelled of flour, wood smoke, and coffee. August Fenwick motioned toward a chair. "I've been expecting this day." He reached beneath the table and removed a small wooden box. Inside rested another folded paper. Not a copy. The original land record. The ink had faded with time, but every mark remained clear. August laid both papers side by side. One belonged to Elias Calloway. The other was the false document used by Briggs. He pointed at the signatures. "Look closely." Ren leaned nearer. At first, they appeared nearly identical. Then she saw it. Her father's capital letter curved in two separate strokes. The forged signature flowed in one smooth motion. August smiled faintly. "Your father broke his thumb years before he signed the real papers." He tapped the false signature. "A man with that injury couldn't make this line." Ren stared silently. It seemed so small. One tiny curve, one simple movement, yet it exposed the entire lie. August folded the papers again. "I kept these because Elias asked me to." He looked toward the frosted window. He always believed winter would reveal the truth better than summer. Before Ren could answer, hurried footsteps rushed toward the building. Someone pounded on the door. Walter's voice broke through the cold air. "Ren!" She opened it immediately. Walter's face had turned pale. "They're coming." "Who?" "Harlan Briggs." He struggled for breath. "He found out August's alive." The room fell silent. Walter looked toward the old man. "He isn't coming alone." August slowly stood from his chair. His hands trembled only slightly as he buttoned his coat. "They're too late." Ren looked between both men. Outside, horses could already be heard climbing the frozen road. The sound grew louder with every passing second. Briggs had finally discovered what his father failed to destroy. And this time, he wasn't coming for the land. He was coming for the only witness who could prove it had never belonged to him. The horses stopped outside. Snow crunched beneath heavy boots. No one knocked. The front door burst open with a hard kick that shook dust from the ceiling beams. Harlan Briggs stepped inside first. Two hired men followed behind him. His coat carried fresh snow across the shoulders. His eyes searched the room until they settled on August Fenwick. "There you are." His voice stayed calm. "I've been looking for you." August remained seated. His weathered hands rested quietly on the table. "I imagine you have." Briggs smiled without warmth. "Old men deserve peaceful winters." He slowly placed a leather pouch on the table. Coins clinked together. "There is enough here for comfort." His eyes never left August. "Say you remember nothing." The room became still. Even the fire seemed quieter. August looked at the pouch for several seconds. Then he pushed it back across the table. "I've worked stone most of my life." His voice remained steady. "I learned long ago that crooked foundations never hold." Briggs' smile disappeared. "You should think carefully." "I already have." The old man folded his hands again. "I've had 3 months to think." Briggs gave a slow nod. Then he looked toward his men. Before either could move, Ren stepped between them. The axe rested loosely in her hands. She did not raise it. She simply stood there. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Walter quietly appeared beside the doorway, carrying nothing more than a shovel handle. Outside. More footsteps approached. Not Briggs' men. Neighbors. One lantern appeared through the frosted window. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the small yard filled with familiar faces. Walter's wife. The Henderson family. Reverend Oakes. The sheriff. Even families Ren had never met stood together beneath the falling snow. No one shouted. No one threatened. They simply stood, shoulder to shoulder. Briggs looked through the window. His jaw tightened. The people he had expected to control had chosen something else. They had chosen each other. Sheriff Carter stepped inside. "This ends today." Briggs looked toward him. "You taking her side now?" "I'm standing beside the law." The sheriff removed folded papers from inside his coat. "The circuit judge arrives tomorrow." He looked directly at Briggs. "You'll answer there." Briggs glanced around the room one final time. No one moved. No one looked away. For the first time, all winter, he understood he was alone. Without another word, he turned and walked into the snow. His men followed. The next morning, the road to Sundance filled before sunrise. Farm wagons stretched for nearly half a mile. Neighbors who had survived because of Ren's shelter rode beside families she had never met. No one had been asked to come. They came anyway. The courthouse overflowed long before the hearing began. Judge William Harper listened quietly as every paper was placed before him. First came Briggs' deed, then the older land certificate. Finally, August Fenwick stood before the court. The old man spoke slowly. He described helping Elias Calloway claim the land years earlier. He described laying stone beside him. He described the accident that had twisted Elias's thumb forever. Then he pointed toward the forged signature. "That curve is impossible." The courtroom remained silent. Judge Harper studied both papers for several minutes. Then he called for fresh ink. He asked August to write his own name. Then he asked Ren to copy the way her father had always signed his. Finally, he compared every stroke, every line, every curve. The difference became impossible to ignore. The forged paper had been made by someone who copied a name, but never knew the man behind it. Late that afternoon, the judge lowered his glasses. "This court finds the transfer fraudulent." His voice carried through every corner of the room. "The Calloway property is restored immediately." He looked toward Briggs. "And criminal charges will follow." No one cheered. No one celebrated. Ren simply closed her eyes for one quiet moment. Then she picked up her father's papers. That was all she came for. Spring reached the valley slowly. Snow pulled away from the hillsides. Creeks began moving again. The hidden shelter remained exactly where it had always been. Ren never sealed its entrance. Instead, she repaired it. She strengthened the stone walls, added better shelves, stored fresh food every autumn. Whenever someone asked why she kept working on a place she no longer needed, she smiled gently. Because another winter is always coming. Word of the underground shelter spread across Wyoming. Ranchers began building similar shelters beneath hillsides. Families learned how stone stored warmth. Children grew up drawing the same simple plans Ren once drew for Walter beside the fire. Knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor, not because someone sold it, because someone shared it. Years later, travelers crossing Crook County often heard the same story. Not about a court case, not about stolen land, but about a woman who walked into a blizzard carrying almost nothing, and came back carrying hope for an entire valley. Long after Ren's cabin had grown old, long after the snow had covered countless winters, the hidden shelter still rested beneath the hill, quiet, strong, waiting. just as Elias Calloway had planned. And every time the first cold wind arrived before winter, someone in the valley still remembered to prepare before the storm instead of after it. If this story stayed with you, thank you for spending your time here. If you enjoy heartfelt American frontier survival stories, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage, resilience, and the Old West.